As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
When I say the sanctions don't work, they don't work in changing the regime, but the sanctions do hurt people in North Korea, but they don't hurt the people who matter.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to episode 11 of the Security Nexus Webinar, North Korea Beyond the Headlines, Unveiling the Reality with Glyn Ford. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army, retired, and DKI APCSS professor. North Korea often captures global attention through its actions, dominating news headlines. Images of missiles and bombastic threats paint a picture of an irrational, isolated regime. But the situation is far more nuanced. It's a nation shaped by conflict, steeled in ideology, and driven by forces we scarcely understand. To grasp North Korea's actions, we must look beyond the sensationalism. Its meteoric nuclear rise isn't just about aggression. It's rooted in a complex interplay of factors, including realist security concerns regarding external threats, domestic political considerations related to regime stability and legitimacy, and normative symbols associated with national identity and prestige. However, the situation is further complicated by internal dynamics. The economy faces challenges under international sanctions, and the society continues to navigate a historical legacy of self-reliance within its highly regulated environment. Understanding these internal factors and key institutional roles is vital for comprehending the broader landscape of the Korean Peninsula and exploring avenues towards stability and peace. To guide us through this complex landscape, I'm honored to welcome Mr. Glyn Ford, a world-renowned expert on North Korea, who has made nearly 50 visits to the country. Together, we'll challenge assumptions and ignite a vital conversation, and we may discover a nation beyond the headlines, a land of unexpected truth. Glyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, I think I'd like to start if you would just tell us your story. What sparked your enduring interest in North Korea?
I had some interest in North Korea, partly back from the 1966 World Cup, when they played in England and they rather heroically beat the Italian team and then lost rather dramatically to Portugal 5-3 after being 3-0 up.
Like the fact that
so that gives you, most people didn't know where it was, nor did I. So, but then I did a lot of work on Japan as a professor at the University of Manchester, and I got a visiting professorship in Tokyo University. And so teaching science and technology policy, not Japanese. And so while I was there, I was urged to go to the Seoul to visit the Kim Dae-jong, who was under house arrest.
Yes.
Because I was a member of the Labour Party, so I was active in, if you want, in party politics.
That's right.
And so I met him then, and I knew him and met him regularly all the way through to his death in 2009. And he got me interested in North Korea. I was one of the members of his Asia Pacific Peace Committee and the rest. So that's when I started. My real engagement didn't really happen until the late 1990s, because then the North Koreans came and knocked on my door and said, we've got a famine, we need food aid, we can't talk to European Commission officials. By then I was a member of the European Parliament. And so can you help it? I said, well, you've got to show me what the situation is. I'm very happy to do what I can to help. So I took an unofficial delegation, myself and two colleagues, to Pyongyang. And it really went from there in a sense, because while I was there, I said, do you like an official delegation from the European Parliament? And they said, yeah. I said, you don't care how I get it? No. So we went back and tabled a very critical resolution demanding that the North Koreans allow us access. And to everyone's surprise, apart from me and my two colleagues, the result of this, sending this letter off, was an invitation to send an official delegation. And that started the whole process. And by 2004, and it's still in existence, the European Parliament has a standing delegation with the Korean Peninsula. north and south. It might be interesting how that changes in the future.
That is an interesting story. And I know even before the show, you and I were talking, we were contemporaries on the peninsula in the very early 80s, doing different things, but that was my beginning.
Yeah, I mean, this all started back in 83,
And so, fascinating. As we set up the episode today, I think let's start with historical dynamic. And so since its inception in 1948, North Korea has navigated a distinctive 75-year path under the Kim dynasty, heavily influenced by its ideology and marked by significant moments that have really shaped its internal and external relations. So here's the question. Could you highlight maybe some key historical events and ongoing issues that have played a critical role in defining North Korea's domestic policies and its posture on the global stage?
Okay. I'm not a historian.
Okay.
Before anyone accuses me of that. But I mean, I would go back even earlier. I think Korea, North and South, to a degree, was shaped by 1905, 1910, the Japanese occupation and colonization of Korea. The struggle against that Japanese occupation created a nation which it didn't really exist before. And so that was a key driver. It also taught North and South the benefits for leadership of the Japanese emperor cult, which again was important. But then you got the division and the arbitrary division in a sense in 1945 after the victory over Japan. Actually was hated by North and South.
That's right.
I mean, it was not just one or the other. They both hated it, and they both wanted unification. And so you actually had a civil war, which turned into a proxy war between China and the United States, which then turned into French warfare and stalemate, which led to the armistice and all of that. I mean, the North Koreans live, in their terms, the fatherland liberation war every day. The South Koreans don't.
Well said. So it is still ingrained in them. It is a part of their makeup. You know, I had actually brought one of your earlier books that you'd given me years ago, talking to North Korea, and so thank you for that. But then, actually, thank you. I knew about your newer book, Picturing the DPRK. You told me last time we met that this was coming out. Thank you for it today, and amazing high gloss pictures in here, and so it is very pleasing to look. But the reason I kind of start with this is because actually this is where I want to go now in the conversation. I want to talk about daily life. Western media frequently highlights North Korea's military activities and its leadership, providing limited insight into the daily experience of its citizens. And so, Glyn, from your extensive visit, 50 visits, could you share insights into everyday life in North Korea that challenge the prevalent narratives and offer a more nuanced understanding of these people? Yeah.
It's not entirely unfair. North Korea is very much a military regime.
It is.
Something like between 1 and 1.4 million men are in the army.
Yes.
And the terms of conscription are something between 10, 12, and 13 years. So there's a big block of men that aren't there.
Sure.
But amongst those that are there, those that get exemptions because they're in, if you want, in essential occupations and the rest, and the women, and they've got the same concerns as everybody else. I mean, they're concerned about, can they get their sons into the right university? They're struggling. Can they? How can they make sure that their grandparents or the parents get health care?
Right.
The younger men, because it's very much a male society. So the people we deal with officially are all men, but the younger officials, they're concerned about girlfriends and complain that unless they get access to South Korean pop music, they struggle to find a girlfriend. I mean, you've got these kind of concerns that are exactly the same kind of concerns you get amongst people of that age in the US and the UK and Europe.
Well, fascinating. I could pull on that so much, but I think let me at least pull on this piece. And You spent a bit of time in Pyongyang, and you could talk maybe a little bit about how they live there, but they live differently in the rural areas.
Yeah, I mean, there are principally three areas in North Korea, very simplistically. The people who matter live in Pyongyang. I mean, those are the people that the regime want to keep on side.
And that's 1.5 million, 2 million, somewhere around.
I mean, this is a population of something like 24, 25 million. 1.5 million are the people who matter.
Okay.
I mean, that's why, if you want not terribly attractive North Korean party officials, can get really nice girlfriends, because if you marry someone who lives in Pyongyang, you get to move there.
That's right.
And so that's got a big advantage. Around Pyongyang, there are controls to get in and out of Pyongyang. If you're in North Korea, you need permission, and you need a pass. Then you've got the countryside, and the countryside is a fairly peasant community.
Okay.
But don't let's exaggerate in the sense that there aren't. I mean, this is not an agricultural society.
Okay.
This is an industrial society that's struggling from an industrial point of view. So you've got the farming community outside in the state farms and the rest. And then you've got what I call the Rust Belt, which is the area on the East Coast, north of Wonsan, probably Hangnam, Hungnam, Kimchek, Chongjin.
Yep.
And that's where you had all the heavy industry, the steel plants, the Vinalon plants, which North Korea's own synthetic, the fertilizer plants and the rest. And they're not really yet working. Well, I haven't been to North Korea for 4 years because of the pandemic. I'm talking from my experience there. They're not really working. And the problem is, up in the Northeast, there's a very narrow coastal belt, and then you've got mountains. So you've got no local food, very limited local food production. And if you're at the end of the food delivery line, you're the people who go hungry. So that's the area where the situation is fairly grim. This year, there's been a rather good harvest, partly because of good weather, but also some changes in agricultural practices. So people are comparatively well off this year in the farming areas and elsewhere. Now, that's not guaranteed to continue. It depends on meteorology, probably more than machinery.
Well said. Let's turn the conversation and let's talk about the nuclear narrative, as it were. So North Korea recently adopted a nuclear first strike policy, and it really sparked intense debate around the world. I have listened to and read these debates, and some of them are fairly stark. And so maybe you could share your insight on the rationale behind this policy shift and its implications for regional and international security.
The most important thing to understand is that North Korea is doing this from a position of weakness, not strength. We've got David and Goliath in the wrong roles. South Korea outspends North Korea in terms of its conventional forces by a factor of 11. When South Korea in 2021 increased its budget by 10%, that was the equivalent North Korea's total military budget. So they can't compete conventionally. So what's the magic wand you can wave? It's the nuclear threat. So that the deterrence of the nuclear threat actually, in a sense, isolates them. Secondly, the nuclear program does two things. It enables you to decamp men out of the army. Because North Korea's two main shortages are energy and men. And it's very much men, because it's the men in the army.
That's right.
So if you can decant 100,000 men out of the army, and you've got civil nuclear power, then you can do something for the economy about dealing with the two choke points that are actually hampering things going forward. So that's the problem, and that's the way it can be dealt with. North Korea has a very old-fashioned model of industrial society. They still imagine factories of 3,000, 3,000, 4,000 workers.
Oh, they got some 50,000.
Well,
that's a massive one.
So
check steel mill is massive.
So you've got those, and so I mean, in a sense, it might just work. the reason for that is that North Korea is probably one of the world's last pools of cheap skilled labor.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most successful activities is Chinese subcontracting in the Rason Special Economic Zone, where the Chinese send over Nike stuff, NBA basketball shirts are produced with made in China labels in North Korea.
Massive quantities, particularly before the latter sanctions.
I mean, the problem with that is, I mean, Beijing sometimes watches very closely. If Beijing is watching closely, Jilin province, which is the border province with Rason, doesn't do anything. As soon as Beijing takes its eye off the ball, because it's so profitable, Jilin re-engages with the North, and so you have this re-engagement. And of course, at the moment, the enthusiasm for sanctions is not very high. Although, I mean, they're not going to be taken off. I understand that, but they're completely useless in terms of shaping the North Korean regime. They locked down for 4 years.
Yes, they did.
Allowed nothing in or out. You really think an extra round of sanctions on North Korean cartoonists is actually going to work?
You're right. They clearly, as you've stated, they locked down their entire country more than the sanctions had locked them down. Your comments about their nuclear directions or ambitions, the rationale for it reminded me even things we had. The Eisenhower administration seeking to reduce manpower, years after the Second World War into the Korean War, but trying to reduce that went to strategies of increasing nuclear capabilities that sort of reduce manpower. I spent the first decade of my career, 82 to 90, 91, dealing with nuclear release, authentication, and delivery, and so had that close up.
I mean, in a sense, where does it go from here? I mean, they will continue to develop their nuclear weapons. I wouldn't be surprised if there's another nuclear test in the next 12 months, and they will continue to develop their missiles. I mean, the problem with their missiles is they've got the range to hit the United States, but they haven't got probably re-entry capacity, and they haven't got the guidance. So what they'd be interested in is developing a hydrogen bomb, because that makes them serious, because an atom bomb is much less serious. Because what they want to do is threaten extended deterrent.
Yes. And so we may, in addition with nuclear tests, which last year there was a lot of thought about when will it be. It's probably not a matter of if, it is when. And there, with that, may also be testing ICBMs at, instead of lofted trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, also the trouble is difficult to test guidance, and it's and I guess whether you can test re-entry, because unlike they haven't got ships out in the South Pacific being able to pick up the debris and checking what's happened, so they're a bit blindsided, but nevertheless, that's where they're going. I mean, they'd be delighted if South Korea went nuclear.
There are many in South Korea that would be delighted.
But I mean, the South, for the North Koreans, it would prove their point.
It would.
There you are. And what sanction are you going to imply to South Korea? And then Japan is likely to follow, or at least ask for U.S. military, U.S. nuclear missiles on Japanese territory.
Yeah, no. And so, that extends the question where I'd ask, what is the ramifications within the region? These do have those ramifications. Those countries that you just named, or any other country, would have to follow the same process, the same step that North Korea did. They would have to invoke Article 10 of the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty on basis of national security, and state that they had to
but as you said, the North Koreans did that, and
then they were sanctioned.
And basically they were told you're not allowed to do that. It would be interesting if, when South Korea does it, whether there's a different answer.
It will be a political decision, I am certain.
Yeah. Oh, of course it will be a political decision, but nevertheless, it will have some, it will focus some interest.
So let's talk a little bit more then on current events. And so recent activities by North Korea, from weapons testing to diplomatic initiatives with Russia, and even more with China, but these are signaling strategic position. And so I guess I'd ask you this question: say more about these actions, and what do they indicate about North Korea's aims?
I mean, there's about a 30-year period, which is absolutely crucial. I mean, North Korea was very successful in playing off Beijing and Moscow against each other.
Yes, that's true.
Now, that worked rather well up to the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989, 1990. And the message of the collapse of the Soviet Empire was trade with Soviet Union / Russia effectively ended. So there was no trade.
That's right.
It literally went down to a few $100,000 a year, and China started asking for a hard currency, which helped trigger the whole famine. The consequence was that North Korea made two decisions. One was to go nuclear, because they wanted to have an independent deterrent. And secondly, they wanted to normalize relations with the United States. And so you had that from 1980, around the framework agreement, 1994,
yep,
through till post Hanoi.
Okay.
Up until then.
2018.
Yeah,
Or
2018,
post Hanoi. So in that case, 2019.
Well,
February.
and it didn't change instantly. But because what the North Koreans learned from Hanoi wasn't that Trump was a bad man. From their point of view, he was incapable of delivering because the people around him sabotaged what he was trying to do. So people like Pompeo and whatever, John Bolton, were actually blamed for that sabotage. But they have no view that that's going to get any better. So the US thing doesn't go. Coupled with Afghanistan and with the rise of China, they've now decided that there's an alternative. You can build a new alliance. The Russians had no interest in North Korea for 25 years.
You're right.
Now they're in need, and North Korea help. And the North Koreans see themselves as a bit back in a situation where they will be able to play Moscow off against Beijing. Won't be quite the same, but it's a better game than the alternative, which didn't work. I mean, Hanoi was such a loss of face, Kim Jong-un, that the prospects of him coming back in any meaningful way are extremely, extremely small.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think even your comments on Russia and China, I mean, Russia is really, that is military assistance, mostly transfer of defense type articles. China, much more in normal trade, as it were. And all of it is limited by their degrees of compliance with UN security. Maybe we'll transfer a little bit and talk about soft diplomacy. Track to diplomacy, which you know well. I mean, it has shown promise where formal avenues may not, and using soft power to build understanding and to prepare for official talk. I mean, your book, I mean, is titled "Talking to North Korea," right? And I love that you got Bill Urey here, who co-author of Getting to Yes, on the front cover, talking about, probably ought to read this book. I have. Here's a question. Maybe you just share some examples of where this approach made headway.
I probably need to be clear.
Do so.
I mean, I don't represent anybody officially. I do have a set of contacts because of my 25 years in the European Parliament. The fact I'm still an active member of the British Labour Party, but I don't represent anybody when I go. I was asked in 2010 by the North Korean party. Most people deal with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Because I'm a politician, I was dealing with the party. They asked me if I would set up a political dialogue with European political parties. Now, you're never going to get any European political parties members that won't fit in a phone book to actually do that. But I did suggest that what I could do is to get together a group of people who were former senior politicians to have a political dialogue. And we had that dialogue from 2010 till 2018. So, I mean, we're hoping it will restart again. They're just beginning to open up. But from that period of time, we traveled there very regularly. We were not in a confrontational, I mean, we asked some challenging questions, but we weren't coming back with a piece of paper signed by both sides,
right,
or anything like that. They didn't pass messages, but they did pass communications. Probably the most important of which was we met with Ri So-young during the 2017, early 2018, when it was fire and fury,
yes, yes.
and I've got a bigger button than you and the rest. And Ri So-young actually said to us, look, I mean, they watched the Iraq war.
Yes, that is right.
So the answer we got from Ri So-young was, if the Americans evacuate non-combatants from South Korea, we'll consider that a declaration of war and act accordingly.
I was engaged in NEO, non-combatant evacuation operation exercises, period, and we were concerned.
Well, we came to the States, I mean, literally a week afterwards, and we were in the White House talking to McMaster, and according to Bob Woodward's book, Fury, yes, he heard this about people who had met with Ri So-young and rushed off to stop Trump ordering the evacuation of non-combatants. So that's probably the most useful thing I've possibly done in my life.
Oh,
so I mean,
that's enough.
So yeah, I mean, the danger. I mean, people talk about the dangers of war between North and South. The biggest danger is accidents.
Oh, I couldn't agree. That's right.
Rather than design, and you're just as dead if it was an accidental war as if it was a deliberate one. So it's that kind of thing, and we certainly had communications to pass on to the Japanese about the fact they're not prepared to do anything more about the abductee issue and the rest. Although, of course, you've recently seen Kishida and Kim's sister talking about re-engagement. But that may happen. So it's a good thing.
It is interesting time when you live in them. Let's talk about the economic challenges and global engagement. So economic pressures intensified by sanctions and the pandemic have nudged North Korea closer to traditional allies like China and Russia, like we were speaking about. So I might ask you this: how might these realignments affect North Korea's economic trajectory and its regional dynamic?
I mean, if Russia and China start to effectively ignore the sanctions regime,
yes,
it makes a big difference. The problem with North Korea's got rare earth.
It does. Quite a bit of it.
And the Chinese are very desperate to have some control over that process.
From Myanmar now.
And you've got the same with Russia. The North Koreans are were reforming the economy. After the famine, a lot of people opened up small shops, and you've got things like what was called the Tongyo market, unification market, won't be called that anymore.
No, it won't be.
Yeah, and some made a success. A few flamed and crashed. Some just survived. A few made money, and you saw the emergence of a nouveau riche. The North Koreans did not like that. These, what I refer to as the Ronin capitalists. They're masterless samurai. What they do like is what they call public-private partnership, where you actually get individuals working with the ministries, with the military, and with the party unit, whether it's running restaurants, whether it's running small shops and the rest. Alongside that, they're actually taking an Asian model of capitalism in a sense. It's the Zaibatsu, it's the Chaebol, it's the state-owned enterprises. People like Air Koryo, the name obviously is an airline. They're now into food and drink. They're now into taxis. So you're seeing, So that's the model. People, the image was, we want a model like the United States. They're not living with that model. They want a model they've got a degree of control over. And of course, in terms of getting economies going, I mean, it's been very successful in Japan and South Korea and in China. So you've had that motivation.
Which quite a bit now. I want to talk about human rights and humanitarian issues. So the debate over human rights in North Korea poses a dilemma between pressure and engaging construction. So, Glyn, how can the international community navigate these concerns while addressing the needs of the North?
I mean, there's a real problem with human rights in that there are a lot of genuine people concerned about the appalling human rights situation in North Korea. No one can describe it as anything else. But there are people who weaponize it. And they're not just individuals, they're government. We've always raised human rights with the North Koreans. In 2001, there was a visit by the Troika, the European Troika, the president of the commission, et cetera, and they agreed a human rights and political dialogue with North Korea. Now, that human rights dialogue was suspended after 2 years when the EU sponsored a resolution in Geneva against human rights in North Korea. And the North Korean argument was, I mean, we can understand you voting for it, but sponsoring it when you're only people with a political dialogue. So what we did, for 4 years, we pressed them to restart the political dialogue. And finally, in 2016, Kang Suk-ju, head of the international department of the party, former chief negotiator at the Six Party Talks, comes to Brussels and said, we're willing to reopen the human rights dialogue with the EU. The answer was, we don't want to, it will make you look too good. Nah. I mean, and again, with the UN has a universal periodic review on human rights. The North Koreans are not bad on that, but it's more disability rights. It's in those areas. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you well illustrated an example of the politicization of this, but then I mean, there are real human beings here. I mean, you've pictured many of them here in your book. They have real needs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but the idea is that the sanction, when I say the sanctions don't work, they don't work in changing the regime, but the sanctions do hurt people in North Korea, but they don't hurt the people who matter. All of the punishment goes on the people at the bottom of the heap, not at the top.
As we get several other questions, but I think I want to wrap up from the audience. But I think I want to wrap up questions I've kind of laid out for you here, thinking about the future. And so, with potential political shifts in South Korea and the United States, and North Korea's own evolving defense strategies and alliance, I mean, the peninsula stands again at a pivotal moment. And so, we might ask ourselves, what factors do you believe will shape North Korea's future? What might that be?
Well, I mean, obviously we had what I term the Kim's State of the Union address in December.
Yes.
And that was a bit of a bombshell. They've abandoned officially reunification. They've identified South Korea as the main enemy.
They have.
And they are going ahead with their nuclear program. They're also planning to redelineate the boundaries of North Korea, which probably by the end of this year, which in itself poses a lot of problems. Now, the people we talk to at the higher ranks of the party have always been very skeptical about early reunification. I mean, Ri So-young, who was the last head of the international department that we spoke to, I mean, would say quite openly, of course, early reunification can only be assimilation. I mean, the South Korean economy is 40, 50 times bigger than ours. I mean, that's assimilation. Now, if the Americans got off our back, they ended the hostile policy, took off the sanctions, we're as bright, we're as intelligent as the South Koreans, people in Singapore, China, whatever. We could grow our economy at 15, 20% a year. Now, in 25 years' time, we're in the same ballpark as South Korea. Then we could talk. Now, that was always the elite view. But that's now become the public view. And there's the isolation. the main enemy argument, it seems to me, is the problem is they've now moved to relying on nuclear weapons. Now, the argument always used to be that the vast majority of people in South Korea were misguided, if you want, Koreans led by the Americans and the right-wing regimes in the South, or the left-wing regimes in the South. I mean, but now they're attempting to, they're effectively dehumanizing them in a way, because nuclear weapons are you can't have targeted attacks with nuclear weapons. So you need to remove the idea that you're killing your brothers. So they're the enemy, and I think that's an element in that. It's quite important.
And so, if you were going to look, I don't know, several years in the future, does it look more of the same, you think? Are we more divided? Is there, what do you think when you look a little bit into this?
I mean, if one wants to be optimistic, one could, if you could get the North Korean economy growing, but that will be despite Western sanctions.
Yeah,
like there's no prospect of those being lifted. If the North Korean economy would start to grow, and they gave some figures that were it seemed to be rather fanciful, but the suggestion is that there has been some small growth in the economy. Things are a bit better than they were
as well
last year. So that's important. If they start engaging with more special economic zones, that would also be a good thing. The problem is they want to talk to the Europeans, but they've said they don't want to talk to the United States, to South Korea. They don't want to get into multilateral negotiations, but they have indicated there's some interest in talking to the Europeans. What they don't realize is it's very difficult for the Europeans at an official level to talk to the North Koreans while they're supplying munitions to Russia, because those munitions are being used to kill other Europeans. So, I mean, they've got a problem. They've got a problem there. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, sir. So let's go ahead now and let's transition to audience questions. So we've curated a diverse selection that cover key areas of interest, and these were submitted during registration. So let's just dive into it. And so the first one, I think we'll talk about is foreign policy directive. So how do you see North Korea's foreign policy evolving with other countries in the coming years? Now, I kind of lead there because that's kind of where you left off. And we'll pull on that one a little more.
I mean, part of the problem is, it depends on China. I mean, China's a little bit nervous. I mean, the North Koreans are not treating the Chinese very well at the moment. The Chinese special representative on the Korean Peninsula has not been allowed to visit North Korea. The Chinese are a bit nervous about their over-engagement with Moscow. So it may be an area where the US and where Washington and Beijing can work together a little, not on overthrowing the regime or anything, but exerting some control. So there's a prospect there that something could be done in exchange for the United States trying to keep, well, if the Chinese were going to keep North Korea under control, and the US would be expected, the Chinese expected to keep South Korea under control, but there's a little bit of nervousness there. So that's a possibility. North Korea is resetting its foreign relations. They've already closed 6 embassies, and it looks like it could probably close another 10. They seem to be largely abandoning their embassies in Africa, South America, even some in Europe, because they're retrenching back. I mean, the only ones they're going to keep are the ones I suspect they need. I mean, my view would be they would keep the one in London. I mean, the UK is on the Security Council. They don't have one in Paris anyway. They'll probably keep one in Germany, because that's the one that in the official embassy.
And the Germans are just out in.
Yeah, and the Germans have just gone in about possibly reopening their own embassy in Pyongyang. So they'll keep a small number. They'll keep one at the UN, but they're retrenching. They see the possibility of an emerging second Cold War, and they're going to be on the Chinese side. They don't really have a lot of choice where they are, and
You know, they don't. And if I think back, after their first nuclear test in 2006, October 2006, at that time, North Korea's economic trade relationship with China was only about 38% of its total.
Yeah.
It was after that, as sanctions went on, that it became increasingly more, and now you picked the number, 98%.
Well, I mean, it will change now because the Russians.
It will.
But I mean, it's still going. The amount of trade they will do outside of the Chinese bloc, if we imagine a second Cold War, is going to be vanishingly small. So, I mean, there are some interests in some trade because, as I said, they've got a lot of interesting minerals, including lithium. So it would be sensible, but I don't know how you do it under the sanctions regime to actually access rare earths from North Korea.
In my 42, 3, whatever the years have been that I've been actively engaged in issues on the Korean Peninsula, we have seemed to have thought that if we just give it time, it'll just implode under its own.
I mean, that's a mistake. It's long been a mistake.
Yeah.
Because North Korean communism, I mean, it's more of a theocracy, frankly, than Marxist-Leninism. It'll be interesting. They took the last pictures of Marx and Lenin down in Kim Il-sung Square probably about 10 years ago for refurbishment. And every time I went after, I said, "You've just built 100,000 houses in Pyongyang. You haven't been able to refurbish 2 pictures. What's wrong?" In the end, the party people just look embarrassed. Oh. So I mean, let's put it where it is.
Right.
But, yeah. Right. So that's where you are.
We're going to another question from the audience. Regional geopolitics and alliance. This is a topic. So what are the broader implications for Northeast Asia's geopolitical landscape of the strengthening ties between Moscow and?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I've touched on it previously. It creates a problem for all of them. But I mean, you've got to offer them an alternative. Now, I'm not sure there's anyone around who's prepared to. If someone was saying to the North Koreans, "Well, if you actually stop supplying arms to Russia, we will put $1 billion into a rare earth mine in North Korea," you might get somewhere. But if you're just saying, "We don't like you doing it, and we're going to pass a nasty resolution in the UN Security Council saying this is wrong," I'm not sure the North Koreans are going to pay much attention.
Yeah, to my earlier point, they probably just won't, roll over and die. And therefore, if they're excised from the, for reasons, excised from the international economic market, they're going to find something to.
Yeah. And the regime has got a degree of resilience because for whatever, by whatever reason, they're actually rooted in Korean history and culture. The Workers' Party of Korea is not one of the feeble parties that you had in much of the Russian Empire in Europe. So I mean, they reflect, in a sense, Korean values which you didn't have in places like Hungary and the Czech Republic and elsewhere in Europe. So those were easy to topple. They didn't have resilience. They were fragile. The North Korean regime is absolutely not a fragile regime in any sense of the term.
I want to move to another question: perception and ideology. So, how does North Korea's view of its governance model align or diverge from the international governance?
Well, I mean, despite my argument, it's not really a Marxist state. It is a Leninist state in the sense of top-down control. I mean, and that being, that was the situation in the Soviet Union up until 1989. Largely the situation in China. It's a party-driven, so it's a party model, and that's what you get. I mean, that's why we're in a lucky position in actually talking to the party, because they're the people who actually make the decisions. But I mean, in as much as there are plenty of countries in the world that are not democracies. It is not a democracy, but it's leadership. I mean, it's not purely Kim Jong-un operating on a whim. I mean, there's a court structure around him, and it's largely functional.
Well, talk about international aid and access. And so can you suggest perhaps strategies to facilitate the reentry of international humanitarian organizations into North?
Well, I mean, I guess at the moment it won't be South Korean, and they probably for a while won't be from the United States. But if people want to get in international aid, they're talking about wanting to engage with the European Union more. It may be that European aid agencies or the European wings of global aid agencies would have easier access than other people. But you need to be looking at what North Korea needs. And at the moment, I mean, you're probably talking more about, you're not talking about emergency food aid at the moment. And maybe if there's a series of bad harvests, you are. At the moment, you're probably talking more about helping them improve their agriculture. I mean, again, the sensible thing for North Korea to do would be to not try and produce all the food it needs. But the problem is that if it doesn't do that, they go hungry. What they should be doing is selling what they've got and buying food in, but that's not a model that's acceptable, that's available to them.
And so, I mean, to pull on your point a bit, understanding what they really need to be speaking with North Koreans, right? I mean, this is not going to be something implanted upon them and be successful. It is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have an alternative offer to the North Koreans that isn't the one they've got now. Because the one they've got now is just going to drive them further in the direction that they're already going. I mean, I don't see any prospect of North Korea giving up nuclear weapons anytime soon. But I do see possibilities where they might slow or even freeze development. That's a very different situation. That puts the whole world in a safer place than we will be if we drive them to actually follow both the nuclear path and their path of alignment with Moscow and the rest.
You know, I have publicly said that we perhaps would be in a better future in a North Korea that may be a interim nuclear friendly state than a belligerent nuclear army.
Oh yeah, I mean, or even a slightly hostile state, but not one that's got a hair trigger.
So let's pull on that a little bit more. Let's talk about leadership, succession, and stability. And so, are there any indications of a leadership succession plan in North Korea, and what impact could such a transition have on the stability? Now, I mean, Kim Jong-un is what, about 40 years old. So, over to you.
I mean, I'm not sure there is a plan because there's no obvious successor. But there's some talk of the. I mean, I guess there's an emergency plan. There is a half brother around who's considered not to be very impressive by many people. But it depends whether you're looking for a real leader or whether you're looking for a figurehead. I mean, Kim Jong-un doesn't do things on his own. There's a group of people around him. There's a court.
And it's just
yeah. I mean, the problem is it's such a male-dominated society. I just see a real problem for the sister kind of taking over. Now, maybe if Kim lives another 20 years and she's able to embed herself in the machinery of the party and the state, that might be different. But if he falls over in the next 5 years, then I see possibly a Kim as a nominal head of state, but the same army generals running the show as we've got at the moment.
I mean, this is, we spoke at the beginning of the episode about this being dynastic, and the most important thing in a dynasty is the bloodline, right?
Yes, I mean, it's perfectly possible, but not all leaders in those dynasties actually have the same leverage over the decision-making processes. Some are leaders, some are more nominal than others.
Yeah, no. Well stated, well understood. Inter-Korean relations and prospects for peace. So let's talk about that a bit. So in the context of fostering peace on the Korean Peninsula, what key concessions do you believe North Korea would need to consider in order to move this?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult. I don't sure. I mean, North Korea sees itself as the weaker of the two sides, and in a sense, certainly if you put Washington and Tokyo on the scales, they are massively weaker. So it's normally the powerful side that offers the concession, not the weaker side. So it seems to me that we're being a bit optimistic there. We're likely to face a bit of a crisis in September if Kim Jong-un offers to redraw the map of North Korea, because he is likely to use the Law of the Sea Convention to actually set the maritime boundaries in the West Sea. And the Law of the Sea Convention, which the United States hasn't signed it, but it's been signed by 100 plus nation states or member states of the UN around the world, would actually give the North Koreans a sizable area of water to the south of what is the de facto boundary at the moment, the Northern Limit Line. Now, it's how does South Korea and the US respond to that? In international law, that's pretty fair game.
It's fairly clear, actually, in international law, how it would go. Because, I mean, for the audience, I mean, the Northwestern Islands, I mean, there are 5 major islands that basically we recognize 3 nautical miles around those islands. That
I mean, if they challenge the islands, it's a whole different problem. If they just reset the boundary.
I guess my point being is there is a lot of open water in between some of those islands that actually, if you look at the map, it is well within North Korea's coastline, which is recognized as 12 nautical. So it is not as simple, even though there are those that perhaps would believe that, you know, this is a settled issue. I think you rightly note that this could be.
I mean, the Northern Limit Line was, as I understand it, a unilateral imposition and was never negotiated because people were so keen to do the armistice deal. The boundaries were set within 10 meters across the DMZ, but they rather abandoned the ocean for consideration.
And you're right. I mean, at the end of the war in '53, the North did not have a viable navy, and so when shortly after the war, the United Nations said we will keep our vessels from going too far north to avoid the conflict, as we should avoid. And so they said, Northern Limit Line, go no further north than this line. Things have changed over time. Nobody who signed the armistice in 1953 thought we would be, 70 years later still.
And there wasn't a Law of the Sea Convention and a Law of the Sea Treaty, which could conceivably end up with very different ways of drawing the boundaries. But the way that they agreed to draw the boundaries is to North Korea's advantage compared to the situation now.
So you brought out at least very well a possible issue in September. Go ahead.
But no, that's why Kim said it should be agreed this year, and there's going to be a Congress in September. So the expectation is they'll do it at that time.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then, as we go to transition here, as I ask all my guests, and I wonder if you might just recommend a book or few that our audience might look at as they explore.
Well, I try not to recommend my own books.
Well, I think I have done that, and I tell you that they are worthy of reading, and I am thankful for this new one. So thank you for that, Glyn. But tell us about.
Yeah, I mean, I've got right. I mean, there's Sig Hecker's book, Hinge Point, which is very good on the nuclear history and the fact that the North Koreans were trying to show to the United States what they were capable of by bringing an eminent U.S. nuclear scientist to Pyongyang and showing him what they were doing. That's very interesting. In an entirely different way, there's a book by Monica Macias, who is the daughter of a dictator of Equatorial Guinea, who was overthrown, and he sent his family, but she was to North Korea, but she was very young. She was only 4 or 5 years old, and she was brought up in North Korea, and she's written a book recently called Black Girl in Pyongyang.
It is a fascinating story, actually, and so that's interesting that you bring that one up. Yeah.
The other one I rather like is Pak Myung's Becoming Kim Jong-un, mainly because she's the most senior official dealing with North Korea in the U.S. State Department. Now, I don't agree with her on a lot, but if you want to see where the Biden administration is coming from, that will tell you almost certainly where it is. So, and it's a rather quirky, well, not quirky book, but a book by Sonia Rang, who was a North Korean living in Japan, and she gives a detail, looks at the schooling and everything else about how they live, and it's obviously a reflection of life in North Korea, because they try and recreate North Korea and Japan in a way you can't investigate in North Korea, but you can by looking at the Korean community, like Cousin Soren, in Japan.
Glyn, this has been fascinating. I am so glad that you were able to stop on your trip here to Hawaii, sit down with us. We've had you in our center before. We are better for it every time you visit with us. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Our session with Glyn has been incredibly insightful. He has masterfully illuminated the complexities of North Korea, helping us to gain a more nuanced understanding of the challenges and potential pathways to. One key takeaway is understanding diverse perspectives and motivation, which are crucial in breaking down barriers and finding solutions to complex challenges. If stories of courage, leadership, and overcoming obstacles resonate with you, then mark your calendars for March 11th, when we will delve into the remarkable journey of Lieutenant Colonel Robin Fellows in Australia's first female commando, A Tale of Resilience. From her humble beginnings to becoming a trailblazer in the Australian Army, Robin's story echoes themes of breaking barriers and defying expectations. Join us for an empowering discussion about resilience, determination, and shattering glass ceilings. Mahalo nui loa, Glyn. Thank you for generously sharing your expertise. Aloha oi, and until next time, this is James Minnich signing off. And don't forget to share your thoughts and questions about today's session in our online YouTube forum. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.